It's hot, it's crowded, and there's a guy in sandals trying to gouge out someone's eyes. Welcome to the Crusades, the most eye-poppingly brutal period of human history. Kick off our series with the First Crusade, which started in 1095 and was prompted by Pope Urban II's speech that called for European Christians to take back Jerusalem from Muslim control. The First Crusade would be a long time coming, though. It took European Christians for years to muster up enough manpower to actually march on the Holy Land. And even then, they weren't totally united. The French and Germans had their own goals for the campaign, but couldn't agree on how to get there. And so the two groups split up. In 1097, German leader Godfrey of Bouillon led his army around the coast of the Mediterranean and into Asia Minor. But things didn't go smoothly. On their way through Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, Godfrey's forces were attacked by the Seljuk Turks. The Turks were led by a warrior named Kiliç Arslan, which means bold lion or fighting lion in Turkish. The name is fitting because he went on to defeat the Crusaders at the Battle of Dorylaeum in 1097, as legend has it. While Godfrey was almost getting stabbed to death, a local Armenian prince named Tancred came to his rescue. So, Godfrey and Tancred became BF, and together they forged an alliance with a bunch of Armenian lords whose lands had been ravaged by the Turks. With the new allies in tow, the Crusaders pushed on until they reached Antioch, which they besieged in early 1098. They spent a whole year just trying to capture this city, but eventually they did, sacking and pillaging it before moving on again. Meanwhile, the French group led by Bohemond of Taranto arrived in Asia Minor in 1098, where they ran into the same issues. Also, one of their leaders, Raymond of Toulouse, got blinded. That wasn't great, but thankfully for him, he didn't have to worry about surviving the march to Jerusalem because he died shortly after. So, all in all, not great news. By 1099, both armies were completely exhausted and demoralized and ready to call it quits. But they managed to pull it together long enough to capture Jerusalem in July of 1099, once they got into the city. Though, the Crusaders engaged in what historian Thomas Esbridge calls the worst excesses of the siege. They massacred everyone inside, men, women, and children, and looted the city before establishing a Crusader kingdom in 1100. Godfrey was elected the first king, but he took the title of Advocate of the Holy Sepulchre instead of king, probably because the title sounded cooler. The Kingdom of Jerusalem lasted only 90 years, falling to Saladin in 1187. But that wouldn't be the end of the Crusades. In fact, it was just the beginning. Let's fast forward a couple centuries to the Children's Crusade of 1212, which, like its name suggests, was when kids tried to take Jerusalem back from the Muslims. This time, though, the kids were prepared. Well, at least one group of them was. In the spring of 1212, a 12-year-old boy named Nicholas appeared in Cologne, preaching about a vision he had from God. He told his followers that if they marched to the Holy Land, the walls of Jerusalem would open up and let them in without fighting. Thousands of children followed him, along with a few adult leaders, including a man named Walter of Albano. But while they were marching, Walter got arrested for raping a child, so that didn't go so well. And then Nicholas ended up in a dungeon, too, after saying some not nice things about the Bishop of Paris. Most of the kids who participated in the Children's Crusade were sold into slavery, and the rest either starved or froze to death. But maybe the greatest tragedy of all is that we do not know what happened to all the children because nobody kept records. At the time, the church hierarchy was more concerned about keeping track of indulgences than kids going missing. Back on track! The Third Crusade was launched in 1189. After Saladin captured Jerusalem and kicked Christian pilgrims out of the city, a lot of important people showed up for this one. Richard, the Lionheart, Philip II of France, and Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa all put their names forward as leaders of the charge. But Barbarossa was busy being a real baddie in Italy and didn't make it very far. While crossing the Salav River in Turkey, his boat capsized and he drowned. So, that was unfortunate. But Richard and Philip were determined to press on. They joined forces with a bunch of local allies and headed toward Jerusalem. Along the way, they laid siege to the city of Acre, which was a huge pain in the butt. Richard wanted to use catapults and artillery, but many of his fellow crusaders thought that would be a sin, since they believed God would help them conquer Jerusalem without violence. Eventually, they did lay siege to Jerusalem, but things didn't go as planned. An earthquake struck, killing dozens and weakening the city walls, but Muslim reinforcements arrived and drove the Crusaders away. When peace negotiations fell apart, Richard retaliated by slaughtering prisoners and executing deserters, which Philip was not cool with. He ended up leaving the crusade and returning home, leaving Richard to continue the fight alone. But Richard got injured, and his horse and his enemy all died in a chariot battle. Then, he got captured by the Ayyubid dynasty and ransomed back to England. So after 10 months, the Third Crusade was over, and Jerusalem was still Muslim. But not all crusades were about taking Jerusalem. Sometimes it was about taking other places. Take the Albigensian Crusade, for example, which was less a holy mission and more a real estate grab. It all started with a dude named Peer, who we know basically nothing about other than the fact that he looked like this. In 1208, Peer got excommunicated by the Catholic Church for some reason we don't know. And in response, he began preaching a message of religious tolerance in southern France, specifically in a region known as Albi. Albi. This area was mostly populated by Catholics, but they also had a large population of a religious group that had broken off from Christianity in the 2nd century and believed that the material world was evil. Soon, Peer's message was spreading among the Catholics in Albi. Tens of thousands converted to Catholicism, which understandably alarmed the church hierarchy. Soon enough, Pope Innocent III declared a crusade against the Cathars and sent Simon de Montfort to lead it. Over the course of 8 years, de Montfort systematically slaughtered every Cathar he could find, burning villages, killing people, raping women, stealing stuff, and appointing Catholics to positions of power throughout southern France. His success paved the way for the establishment of the Catholic Inquisition in 1232, which used torture and execution to root out heresy. As you can probably tell, by this point in history, the Crusades weren't really about the original goal of retaking Jerusalem. By the time the 8th Crusade rolled around in 1270, it was more about punishing non-Christians and protecting trade routes to the Holy Land. King Louis IX of France led this mission, which he called the Last Crusade, though, spoiler alert, it definitely wasn't the last. And as soon as he arrived in North Africa, he turned his attention to the city of Tunis, which at the time was ruled by the Hafsid dynasty. Louis made some headway in the siege, but his army was weakened by disease and famine, and he ended up having to come back to France. When he returned, he brought with him an unknown illness that killed 10,000 people. History remembers him as the Crusading King, and not the plague-ridden one, which is a little unfair. Louis IX might have called his crusade the Last Crusade, but he was wrong. The Crusades continued on and off for another 200 years. There were several more that targeted Muslims in France and Spain. And there was even one massive crusade against the Teutonic Order, after they got a little too powerful in the Baltic. We'll tell you about all those and more next time.